Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, editorial consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On June 24th, last Saturday, our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi concluded his 3-day visit to the US. The much hyped visit where Prime Minister Modi delivered an address to the joint session of the Congress, met CEOs of tech companies and was accorded the highest level of diplomatic protocol, has been seen as another landmark that has drawn US and India closer than ever. To understand the significance of this visit and the assumed closeness of India and US, we have with us Mr. Kallol Bhattacherjee. Mr. Kallol is the Senior Assistant Editor, Foreign Affairs with India's leading newspaper, The Hindu. A journalist of highest standing, he has written extensively on India's foreign affairs and has also authored the book, The Great Game in Afghanistan, Rajiv Gandhi, General Jia and the Unending War. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you so much, Hina.
So from June 21st to June 23rd, our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi visited US on a 3-day long visit upon invitation of the US President Joe Biden. What are the major highlights or successes of this visit from India's foreign policy perspective?
Well, I would really look at the visit as a kind of a grand symbolic gesture curated by the superpower to express some sort of satisfaction about the state of the relationship that the two countries have maintained over the last 25 years. So I'm not going to count the successes because the visit itself in itself is an expression of success. Success of a continuum. This is a success of nearly 25 years of successful relationship. So, I'm not saying that the relationship before 1998 was not successful. The relation between these two of the biggest powers in the world, India being in this side of the world, and the United States being the superpower, has maintained relationships since the beginning of India's independence. But then in the present condition, especially after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, India's relation with the United States was reignited after the thermonuclear testing in the Pokhran Desert by the Vajpayee government in 1998. So from 1998 July onwards, when the Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot dialogue began, till date, till 2023, I would say that 25 years what the relationship has really witnessed is that there is a consensus, political consensus, not just in India, but also more importantly in the United States. And what appears is that this political consensus has remained in place despite all the changes and sometimes even very charged political atmosphere in the United States. And India of course is a great power or an aspiring great power, sometimes even a global power, as some people describe. But in case of the United States, it's nevertheless the sole superpower in the world today. And it appears that the United States has really initiated this visit because it is the United States government that has invited the Prime Minister. So I would really say that the visit itself is an expression from the American side that the state of relationship has been so significant and the two countries are so significant for each other that there is no other way of looking at each other but to look at each other through understanding of consensus, and consensus that basically cuts across all ideological and all other differences and criticisms.
So while there has been a consensus from both the sides for last 25 years, do you think that particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, US and India have moved closer to each other, and has it been at the cost of India's previous policy of non-alignment?
I'm reminded of what Mr. Brajesh Mishra, the late Mr. Brajesh Mishra, used to say. He was sometimes described as a critique of non-alignment because he joined Indian Foreign Service in Nehruvian period, and it used to be described that perhaps Mishra would not always be supportive of Nehru's idea of non-alignment. But when Brajesh Mishra became the National Security Advisor, and under him some of the more interesting dialogue took place with the United States. And remember, he in fact held dialogue with even Madeleine Albright, going all the way sometimes to third countries like Israel. What Brajesh Mishra said is that India was and India will remain non-aligned, but certain relationships at certain moments will be more intimate. So how India decides to do intensified non-alignment, at what point India will come closer to certain countries, that will depend on India's self-interest. So yes, under the particular, in the last 9 years under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we have seen signs of India and the US working very closely. For example, on the trade front, on financial and on economic affairs, like we have digital economy, for example. The two countries have worked very closely on also multilateral areas, whether sometimes even in global counter-terror campaigns, which have seen ups and downs, but nevertheless they have maintained, some sort of close collaboration there also. But it's again, there is not really a kind of a compromise with the non-aligned policy, because sometimes India will be closer to certain countries, and it's understood that this time it's with the United States. Over the last 9 years, it's been a very intense collaboration, whether on multilaterals, sometimes even as we are seeing in Indo-Pacific, or the technology domain, as we are now talking about the semiconductor processing and opening up the quantum computing and artificial intelligence, those domains. So these are like new horizons that are opening up, and under the current circumstances, perhaps according to Brajesh Mishra's terminology, I would say that India is meant to come closer to the United States without really sacrificing non-alignment as a principle of the state. And that is why perhaps we don't use the term non-alignment. What we use more increasingly is the plurilateralism, which is just to convey that we have not really jettisoned non-alignment, but we are moving on with a different formulation of the same idea.
Can this increased intimacy between India and the US and Indo-US ties can be seen on their own without factoring in, say, Russia, China or Pakistan, or are both the nations moving close together because an enemy's enemy is a friend?
India and the US, they basically look at each other or view each other through the memories of their establishments. By establishments, I am talking about the core of their states. And when they look at India, by they I mean the American government or the American establishment, they look at India, who they find? They find one of the founding members of the United Nations. That is not someone that they can find in China. China was not a founding member of the United Nations. Where was India when the United Nations was being formed as part of the post-Second World War world structure? We were not a free country at that time, but our diplomats, even back then, were present. They were not only articulating our, so to say, government position, so to say, the British colonial government position, they were also articulating the nationalist upcoming government's position. So we had Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in San Francisco conference. And then subsequently, when the charter was being framed and signed, it was the Indians who were part of it. So when they look at India and they think of engaging India, they find a country that has been part of holding the world structure in a position of stability through all the ups and downs. That is not something that countries like China and Russia, despite our differing relationships with both those countries, and I'm saying, having taken those issues into consideration, that they can't be compared with India, because both Russia and China have certain intentions that they often express because they want to change the international domain. India, on the contrary, and you must have seen how India conducts itself when Russia talks about de-dollarization, or how India conducts itself when China talks of Belt and Road Initiative. which is a very clear expression of Chinese intention that the Chinese would create an alternative world system. Sometimes the Russians say through de-dollarization and through more aggressive multi-polarity, the world will change. India, however, takes a middle ground. India is a cautious, power. India doesn't believe in disturbing the stability in the world, because our primary focus is really to ensure that our teeming millions get enough food. Our people, the 1.4 billion Indians should get access to high technology. They should get access to nutrition. They should be safeguarded from challenges of climate change. So those are the primary requirements of India. So for that, we really have to maintain, and the state has so far maintained a rather careful approach without showing any intention of disturbing the international domain. So when the Americans look at India, this is my understanding, of course, that I feel that they look at a country that has been that was present at the beginning of the post-Second World War world structure as it came in mid-1940s. And they feel that such a veteran power can be a stabilizing, create a stabilizing effect as the world really moves into the 21st century. So I think we should really look at India-US relation, especially in the immediate backdrop of this particular state visit of Prime Minister Modi, without really bringing in the third countries like Chinese and the Russians. Of course, the Indo-Pacific context is very, very pronounced, and there is no doubt about the reason that we are also experimenting with that option. But at the end of the day, I would say that the Americans look at India as a more stable and a cautious country that will play, or that is equipped to play a more kind of a sustaining role for the international order.
Do you think that it is because of India's cautious and stable approach that after the bilateral talks that were held between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, after which they released a 58-page joint statement which called on Pakistan to take action to ensure that no land under its territory, under its control, is used to sponsor terrorism? But this statement did not mention Russia or the US formulation of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Do you think it was because US continues to see it as India as a stabilizing factor and wouldn't want to ruin it for its own use?
Well, India's relation with Pakistan vis-a-vis United States is one compartment of the matter. And India's relation with Russia and the Ukraine crisis and the demands or the understandings that the Americans have of that crisis is of a different order altogether. So while India's concerns about cross-border terrorism from Pakistan understandably stretch back in time to several decades, but India's relation with Russia and what India can do as far as the Ukraine crisis is concerned is of a very serious magnitude for the United States itself. And let's also remember that the United States has had nurtured a very close relation with Pakistan going all the way back to the 1940s and late 1940s and 1950s, when Pakistan became a member of the US-led blocs like SEATO and CENTO. But Pakistan and the US at present are really not the most important things in the scheme of things of the superpower. The Americans are looking at the Ukraine crisis as the biggest real-life power problem that the American state is facing. The crisis that the Pakistan has posed, or the challenge that Pakistan has posed for India, is of course of a very serious nature, and we are quite, one should always remember that there were one decade, starting with 1988, after the end of the Rajiv Gandhi government, till throughout the VP Singh government, Chandrasekhar government, Narasimha Rao, of course, and the 1996 and 98 government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when India complained bitterly about the cross-border terrorism coming from Pakistan, but the Americans were not willing to help us at that time. But nevertheless, it took time, and when the dialogue between India and the US took place, they came around to our side. That's an old story, because now it appears like an old story because the dialogue has really delivered the goods for us. That now the United States is on the same page as far as the cross-border terrorism from Pakistan is concerned. But since you talked about the Ukraine crisis, I will say that let's also remember the Ukraine crisis is a serious crisis for the United States itself and its ambitions for global domination. Because if Russia succeeds in completing the Ukraine operation, or rather the quote-unquote the special military operation on Ukraine, then the world changes. And if the world changes, then the American domination or the unipolarity of the world ends. So therefore, the Ukraine crisis is actually a more compelling crisis from the American side. Whereas the Pakistan crisis, the challenge from Pakistan is really an American, really an Indian concern. So there are two different dimensions here that we have to really remember.
So, in terms of business, during this visit, trade agreements were signed, agreements for transfer of technology in defense sector, the deal on purchase of Reaper armed drones, and joint mission by NASA and ISRO, and the Artemis Accords for civil space exploration. All these look like success. How do you see them from India's perspective?
This particular visit and the list of agreements that you mentioned, the agreements were long time in the making. But as I said, this is also a relation that has continued. And these are just a few of the agreements. Remember that this relation has talked about transformative high-tech collaboration between India and the US. The things that are yet to come from the relationship are going to be, or at least we expect them to be, of transformative value for India, because they include things like AI, quantum computing, and those other things that we are yet to see in all their glory in the Indian market. Because now we are talking about diversifying the supply chain. Now, if that happens, if the supply chain is really refashioned for the Indian economy to acquire a different orientation in the international market, that will be a kind of really a groundbreaking development for the 21st century India. So I'm not just going to count, these are these important deals, and also drone deals and the jet engine deal. These are important deals, always kept as the icing on the cake. But let's also remember the cake has been built over many years, and the cake is full of many more promising items that it is yet to show to the world. So I would say that these deals are of course very important, and they were preserved for this sort of a visit, of a state visit. But I would really say that the high point of this visit is yet to be sort of presented before the world, because it will take a lot of time in sort of presenting them and bringing out to the general public, because it includes, as we mentioned, the AI and other such transformative technology. So that will take some time, but those are the real deliverables.
So, as I said in the intro, that this is a much hyped visit, and the media has constantly been reporting minute to minute on the what Prime Minister Modi is doing, and is the hype justified?
Well, there is always something of a political culture of a country, or there is always the culture of protocol for a particular country. And if you look back in time, then India's protocol in terms of India's history, in this history of Indian protocol, or in the foreign ministry, in the Indian diplomatic circles, it goes back in time in 1955, when the Bandung conference was held, and when people like Khrushchev came from Soviet Union, and in 1959 when President Eisenhower came to visit India. In all those visits, including the ones said that Nehru, when Nehru's visits to Washington DC, Indira Gandhi's visits to Washington DC, Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to Washington DC. You remember when Atal Bihari Vajpayee went to the US, and it was a very crucial meeting with the Bill Clinton government, and his physical condition was not really, he was not in the perfect shape at the time, and so the media was full of personal details of the Prime Minister's health, because we as reporters, we like to present our leaders' engagements with the world in a particular light. But when Indian leaders interact with the superpower, whether it is the United States or the Soviet Union or the sole superpower today, the United States, the Indian media has always shown these tendencies of hyping up. That's just the culture of our media, and we can't really do otherwise. Perhaps some of us, we have participated ourselves in presenting these visits in a certain way, because these are very special kind of visits. Let's also look at them. It's not like Mr. Modi's visit to say, we can't compare it with really any other visit, because a state visit to the United States as the Prime Minister of India, it will always be a unique visit. And perhaps the media will present it with a bit of hype and a spice. That's, I think, is okay.
To go back to something that you said earlier about, in the joint statement, the US did address India's concern of Pakistan, but, India did not have to put up a view on Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it seems that despite being the bigger partner, US has given much space to India for it to continue as a stabilizing effect it has. So why is USA quoting India after all?
United States is a very unique kind of a power, and we always have to remember that though we just talked about hyping the visit, the hyping of the visit perhaps sometimes makes us optimistic, but always we should remember that diplomacy is a grim game. And sometimes, despite all the optimism that we find in diplomacy, we have to really fall back and take a step back and look at the whole development, or rather all these protocols and celebrations and dinners in a cynical way. Because we really need to understand, why is the superpower courting India? United States uses technology as a coin to expand and to intensify and to basically broaden its own circle of power. This is the history of the United States. It is the paramount power in the history of world technology. And the United States has always used technology to increase its number of friends. So in 2023, United States is telling India that AI, quantum computing, and all those technological items will be on the table. But the United States has done similarly in 1980s with India, when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister. And a whole lot of items like the supercomputer, submarine technology, and all those things used to be discussed with India. But then again, the question is, why does the United States repeatedly come back with these promises of technology? Because the United States wants to solve its own biggest real-life power problems. And to solve those power problems, it requires the biggest countries in the world on its side. And that is the sole aim of this visit as well. Because the biggest problem, as we just discussed, that if the Russian government, or Vladimir Putin's government, succeeds in the special military operation in Ukraine, then the world changes. No doubt about it. Then Russia becomes the superpower. So to prevent it, the United States will have to have India on its side. As a rising power of the 21st century, India's vote will matter a great deal. And perhaps that is the reason that they have done their careful calculation that for the last 25 years, India has maintained kind of a stable relationship with the United States. And they must perhaps take note of this commitment from the Indian side. And they have given us the promise of high-tech collaboration today in the way that they gave us in 1985. We are in 2023. In 1985, they similarly gave us the high-tech collaboration. And in 1985, the real-life power problem that the Americans were facing was the demand for Soviet evacuation from Afghanistan. That we mentioned in my book also, and I discussed in my book then how technology drove that diplomacy from the American side. Similarly, with the Vajpayee government, the Iraq issue was a real problem that the George W. Bush government had got into, and they wanted Vajpayee's help. But then Vajpayee and Brajesh Mishra, Jaswant Singh, they had a diplomatic team in which they kept the dialogue going, and they did not allow any breakdown to take place, and they managed to convince the Americans about the demands and the requirements of Indian democracy. So India did not get involved with the Iraq crisis. India did not send soldiers, as we all remember. So I would say they have come back to us with again one more round of promise of technological items. And in between, let us also not forget that Manmohan Singh government was also assured of promises of technological gifts, but then today we don't find a single nuclear reactor in India. That's also a reality that we have to consider. But then Manmohan Singh government didn't really take India in that direction that the nuclear deal could have propelled, and that India did not really become very close to the United States despite the nuclear deal. And though the nuclear deal's a logical conclusion, I think we are yet to see, because once maybe at one point when the nuclear reactors come, we can say, okay, that Manmohan Singh's initiatives have borne fruit. But as of now, it appears that the real driving force, number one, is of course the India-US economic relationship, the trade relationship that India and the United States have. And number two, and perhaps more than the economic relation, because we have to really think about the American intention in this game, is the real-life power problem that they're facing in Ukraine, and possibility of a similar problem erupting in the Taiwan region. Because if that happens, then the world really shatters. The world as we know would be changed forever if both the conflicts go off at the same time. As of now, we have the Ukraine conflict blowing up. So I would say, to answer your question, that we really have to see through this grim game of diplomacy. What is really the superpower's intention here? And I think the superpower is in a very tight spot as of now.
Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your insightful opinion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.